The dust kicked up around her worn boots as she knelt on the porch of the weathered homestead, her slender fingers methodically sorting through the pile of dried beans spread across a faded cotton cloth, separating the good from the bad with practiced efficiency that spoke of too many lonely dinners just like this one. Harrison Fletcher reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the property, his gray eyes taking in the scene before him with the caution of a man who had learned not to trust easily. The woman hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on her task, her auburn hair escaping from its pins and catching the late afternoon Colorado sunlight. He had been riding for 3 days straight, and the town of Benton was still another 5 miles down the road, but something about the isolated cabin and the solitary figure made him pause. "Madam," he called out, his voice rough from disuse and trail dust. She startled, her hand flying to her chest as she looked up. Even from this distance, Harrison could see the wariness in her green eyes, the way she positioned herself closer to the door. Smart woman. It was 1878, and a woman alone out here had every reason to be cautious of strangers. "I don't mean you any harm," Harrison said, keeping his hands visible on the saddle horn. "My canteen's run dry, and I was hoping to refill it from your well before heading into Benton." The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his trail-worn appearance, the way he sat his horse, the gun at his hip. Whatever she saw must have satisfied some internal measure because she gave a slight nod. "The well is around back," she said, her voice carrying a cultured accent that seemed out of place in this rough country. "Help yourself." Harrison tipped his hat and guided his bay gelding around the side of the cabin. The well was in good repair, which spoke well of whoever maintained this place. He dismounted, every muscle protesting after 3 days of hard riding, and drew up a bucket of cool, clear water. He filled his canteen first, then drank deeply, the water tasting better than the finest whiskey after days of rationing. When he led his horse back around front, the woman was still there, though she had moved to stand, her hands clasped in front of her worn calico dress. Up close, he could see she was younger than he had first thought, probably mid-20s, with a delicate bone structure that spoke of better times. But there was something in her eyes, a hardness that matched his own, the look of someone who had seen too much and survived it. "Thank you, madam," Harrison said, preparing to mount up. "You look like you could use a meal," she said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise her as much as him. "I was just about to start dinner." Harrison hesitated. He had learned long ago to keep moving, not to form attachments, not to let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. But his stomach growled at the thought of a home-cooked meal, and there was something in the woman's expression that suggested she was as surprised by her offer as he was. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said, though even to his own ears, the protest sounded weak. "It's just beans and cornbread," she said with a slight shrug. "Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to share it if you don't mind waiting while I finish sorting these and get them cooking." Harrison found himself nodding, tying his horse to the porch rail and following her up the steps. She settled back down with her beans, and he stood awkwardly for a moment before she gestured to the other end of the cloth. "You can help if you want it to go faster," she said. "Just toss the bad ones in that bowl there, the rocks too." He lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the porch, his joints protesting. His fingers, more accustomed to handling reins and guns than domestic tasks, felt clumsy as he began sorting through the beans. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the occasional clink of a rock hitting the discard bowl and the distant call of a hawk. "I'm Josie Parker," she said finally. "Most people call me Josie." "Harrison Fletcher," he replied. "Most people call me Harrison." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Not much for nicknames. Never saw the point. They continued sorting, and Harrison found the rhythmic task oddly soothing. It had been years since he had done anything this domestic, this peaceful. Since before the war, before everything had gone wrong, before he had built the walls around his heart so high that nobody could scale them. "You have family in Benton?" Josie asked, her tone carefully casual. "No family anywhere," Harrison said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Just looking for work." She nodded, not pressing, and he found himself grateful for that. Most people either pried or offered unwanted sympathy. She did neither. "What about you?" he found himself asking, despite his usual reticence. "This place seems isolated for a woman alone." Her hands stilled in the beans for a moment before resuming their work. "I'm not usually alone. My brother went into Benton 3 days ago to sell some cattle. He should have been back yesterday." The worry in her voice was carefully controlled, but Harrison heard it anyway. 3 days was too long, especially if the brother had been expected back in one. "Maybe he decided to stay an extra day," Harrison offered, though he knew as well as she did that a man didn't leave his sister alone on an isolated homestead any longer than necessary. "Maybe," Josie said, but she didn't sound convinced. They finished sorting the beans, and Josie gathered up the corners of the cloth, carrying it inside. Harrison hesitated on the threshold, old habits warning him about the vulnerability of being inside an unfamiliar place. But Josie had already moved to the stove, pouring the beans into a pot and adding water from a pitcher. The cabin was small but tidy, with 2 doors leading off what Harrison assumed were bedrooms, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, and there were small touches that spoke of a woman's hand. A faded quilt draped over the rocking chair, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a book sitting on the mantel. "You can sit if you like," Josie said, gesturing to the table. "This will take a while to cook." Harrison lowered himself into one of the chairs, watching as she moved around the small space with efficient grace. She added wood to the stove, stirred the beans, then began mixing cornmeal with water and lard in a bowl. "How long have you been out here?" Harrison asked, surprising himself again. He wasn't usually one for conversation. 2 years, Josie said, pouring the cornbread batter into a cast iron skillet. "My brother and I came out from Boston after our parents died. We wanted a fresh start." "Boston." That explained the cultured accent, the refined features. "That's quite a change." "Yes," she said simply, sliding the skillet into the oven. She turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "What about you? Where are you from?" "Here and there," Harrison said evasively. "Nowhere in particular." Josie studied him with those perceptive green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, past the walls he had so carefully constructed, down to the wounded man beneath. "You don't have to tell me," she said quietly. "We all have things we'd rather not talk about." The understanding in her voice made something in Harrison's chest tighten. He looked away, focusing on the worn floorboards. "I was in the war," he heard himself say. "Afterward, I went home to Texas and found my wife had died of fever while I was gone. Our daughter, too. She was only 3. The silence that followed was heavy with grief, not just his own but hers too, he realized. When he looked up, Josie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she said, and unlike the platitudes he had heard from others, these words carried real weight. "It was a long time ago," Harrison said, though time had done little to heal the wound. 10 years now. "Time doesn't always make it easier," Josie said softly. "Just different." She moved to check the beans, stirring them with a wooden spoon, and Harrison found himself watching the way the lamplight caught in her hair, the graceful line of her neck. He looked away quickly, disturbed by the observation. He had no business noticing such things, no business feeling anything at all. "I was engaged once," Josie said, her back still to him. "In Boston. He was from a good family, very proper, very respectable. Then he found out my father had lost everything in bad investments, that there would be no dowry, no fortune. He ended our engagement the next day." "He sounds like a fool," Harrison said, and was rewarded with a surprised laugh. "Perhaps," Josie agreed, turning to face him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But it taught me that most people only care about what they can get from you. My brother was the only one who stood by me. He sounds like a good man." "He is," Josie said, and the worry crept back into her expression. "Which is why I'm concerned that he hasn't returned." Harrison made a decision he knew he would probably regret. "I'll ride into Benton tomorrow and see if I can find any news of him. What's his name?" "Jacob," Josie said, hope and caution warring in her expression. "Jacob Parker. He's 26, brown hair, about your height. He was driving a wagon with 4 head of cattle." "I'll ask around," Harrison promised, wondering what had possessed him to make such an offer. He had planned to ride into Benton, find work, and keep moving, the way he always did. Getting involved in other people's problems was a good way to get hurt. They ate dinner in companionable silence, the beans seasoned with a bit of salt pork and herbs, the cornbread golden and still warm. It was simple fare, but it was the best meal Harrison had tasted in months, maybe because it was shared, maybe because it was made with care instead of the hurried trail cooking he usually managed. "You can sleep in the barn if you want," Josie said as she cleared the dishes. "There's fresh hay in the loft and it's more comfortable than sleeping on the ground." "Thank you," Harrison said, standing, "for the meal and the hospitality." "Thank you for offering to look for Jacob," Josie said, meeting his eyes. "It means a lot." Harrison nodded and let himself out, leading his horse to the barn. It was a sturdy structure, well maintained like everything else on the property. He unsaddled his gelding, rubbed him down, and made sure he had water and feed before climbing up to the loft. The hay was indeed fresh and sweet-smelling, and despite the strange turn his day had taken, Harrison found himself settling in with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, the soft shuffling of his horse below, the distant howl of a coyote, the wind rustling through the trees. And he thought about Josie, about the sorrow in her eyes that matched his own, about the unexpected connection he had felt sitting across from her at that rough table. It scared him, that connection. He had sworn after losing his wife and daughter that he would never let anyone close again, that the pain of loss was too great to risk. He had spent 10 years building walls, becoming the kind of man who rode alone and liked it that way. But in the space of a few hours, Josie had made him question those walls, made him wonder if maybe he had been wrong to shut himself off so completely. Harrison closed his eyes and forced himself to think about practical matters. Tomorrow, he would ride into Benton and look for Jacob Parker. He would ask questions, follow any leads, and hopefully return with good news. Then he would move on, the way he always did, before the cracks in his walls could widen any further. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, his dreams were full of green eyes and auburn hair and the sound of a woman's laughter he hadn't heard in far too long. Morning came too early, the sun streaming through the gaps in the barn walls and the rooster crowing his challenge to the new day. Harrison rose, brushed the hay from his clothes, and climbed down from the loft. He saddled his horse and was leading him out when he saw Josie coming from the cabin with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I made you some breakfast," she said, handing him the bundle. "Biscuits and bacon. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "You didn't have to do that," Harrison said, though the gesture warmed something in his chest. I know, Josie said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill. But I wanted to. Besides, you're doing me a favor looking for Jacob. Harrison tucked the bundle into his saddlebag and mounted up. From his vantage point on horseback, he could see the worry etched in Josie's features, the way she twisted her hands together. I'll be back before dark, he promised, and I'll bring whatever news I can find. Be careful, Josie said. Benton can be rough, especially for strangers. Harrison nodded and turned his horse toward the road. As he rode away, he couldn't help but look back. Josie was still standing there, a solitary figure in front of the cabin, and the sight of her made his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to name. The 5-mile ride into Benton gave him too much time to think. He had been a fool to stay, even more of a fool to offer to look for Jacob Parker. What was it about Josie that had gotten past his defenses so easily? Maybe it was the loneliness he had seen in her eyes, a mirror of his own. Maybe it was the way she had spoken of loss and betrayal with understanding rather than bitterness. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of being alone, tired of keeping everyone at arm's length, tired of the emptiness that filled his days. Benton was a typical frontier town, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a hotel, and a scattering of other businesses. Harrison tied his horse to the rail in front of the saloon and pushed through the batwing doors. It was early yet, but there were already a few men inside, nursing drinks and playing cards. The bartender looked up as Harrison approached, his expression neutral but wary. "What can I get you?" "Information," Harrison said, laying a coin on the bar. "I'm looking for a man named Jacob Parker. He would have come through here 3 or 4 days ago with a wagon and 4 head of cattle." The bartender's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. He glanced at one of the card players, a quick look that told Harrison more than words could have. "Don't know the name," the bartender said, but his tone rang false. Harrison laid another coin on the bar. "It's important. His sister is worried about him." One of the card players, a grizzled man with a scar running down his left cheek, stood and approached. "You a friend of Parker's?" "A friend of his sister's," Harrison said carefully, sensing the tension in the room. The scarred man studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the door. "Let's talk outside." Harrison followed him out into the morning sunlight, his hand resting casually near his gun. The man led him around the side of the building, checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "Parker came through 4 days ago," the man said quietly. "Sold his cattle to the buyer at the stockyard, got a good price too. Then he went to the saloon to celebrate, and he got into a poker game with some men passing through. They accused him of cheating, and things got ugly." Harrison's stomach sank. "How ugly?" "There was a fight. Parker held his own, but one of them pulled a knife. Sheriff broke it up before anyone got killed, but Parker was hurt bad. They took him to the doctor's house." "Is he still there?" "Far as I know," the man said. "Doc's place is 3 buildings down from the general store, white house with green shutters. You can't miss it." "Why didn't anyone send word to his sister?" Harrison demanded. The man shrugged. "Nobody knew he had a sister. He didn't have any identification on him, and he was too feverish to tell anyone where he was from. Doc's been taking care of him, but it's been touch and go." Harrison thanked the man and headed for the doctor's house at a fast walk. The description had been accurate: a white clapboard house with green shutters, and a small sign announcing it as the office of Dr. Samuel Hendricks. Harrison knocked on the door, and after a moment it opened to reveal a middle-aged man with kind eyes and tired features. "I'm looking for Jacob Parker," Harrison said without preamble. "Is he here?" "He is," the doctor said, studying Harrison. "Are you family?" "A friend," Harrison said. His sister sent me. She's been worried sick." The doctor's expression softened. "Come in. I'm Dr. Hendricks. Mr. Parker has been quite ill, but he's finally starting to improve." Harrison followed the doctor through the house to a small room at the back. A young man lay in the bed, his face pale and drawn, a bandage wrapped around his torso. His eyes were closed, and for a moment Harrison feared they had arrived too late. "Jacob," the doctor said gently, touching the young man's shoulder. "You have a visitor." Jacob's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in Harrison's presence. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice weak. "Harrison Fletcher. Your sister is worried about you. She asked me to come find you." Relief flooded Jacob's face. "Josie, I need to get word to her." "She must be frantic." "She is," Harrison confirmed. "What happened?" Jacob told his story, confirming what the scarred man had said. He had been knifed in the fight, the blade puncturing his lung. If Dr. Hendricks hadn't been skilled and quick, Jacob would have died. "How long before he can travel?" Harrison asked the doctor. "At least another week, maybe 2, Dr. Hendricks said. "The wound is healing well, but moving him now could reopen it, and that could be fatal." Harrison thought quickly. "I'll ride back and tell Josie. She'll want to come stay with him, I imagine." "There's a hotel in town," the doctor said. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and respectable. Mrs. Morrison, who runs it, is a good woman." Harrison thanked the doctor and promised Jacob he would return with Josie. As he rode back toward the homestead, his mind was already working through the logistics. Josie would need to pack, and someone would need to stay at the cabin to look after the animals and the property. He could do that, he supposed, though the thought of staying in one place went against every instinct he had developed over the past 10 years. But even as he considered offering, he knew he would do it. For Josie. For the woman who had shown him kindness and trusted him with something important. For the woman who had somehow managed to crack the walls around his heart in less than a day. The sun was high in the sky when he reached the cabin. Josie must have been watching for him because she came running out as soon as he appeared, her face tight with anxiety. "Did you find him?" She called out before he had even dismounted. "I found him," Harrison said quickly, wanting to ease her worry. "He's alive, Josie. He's hurt, but he's going to be okay." The relief that washed over her face was profound, and Harrison found himself moving instinctively to steady her, as her knees seemed to buckle. His hands on her shoulders felt right in a way that should have terrified him. "Tell me everything," she said, looking up at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul. They went inside, and Harrison told her everything the scarred man and the doctor had said. Josie listened intently, her hands clenched in her lap, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks when he described Jacob's condition and the doctor's prognosis. "I need to go to him," she said immediately. "I need to pack." "There's a hotel in town where you can stay," Harrison said. "It might be a week or 2 before he can travel." Josie nodded, already moving toward her bedroom. She paused at the door and turned back. "What about the cabin, the animals?" "I can stay here and look after things," Harrison heard himself say, "if that's all right with you." Josie's expression softened. "You would do that, but you were looking for work in Benton." "The work can wait," Harrison said and realized he meant it. "Your brother needs you, and you need someone to watch over this place." "I don't know how to thank you," Josie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You already did," Harrison said. "You showed me kindness when I was a stranger. Let me return the favor." Josie disappeared into her bedroom, and Harrison could hear her moving around, packing her things. He went outside to check on the animals, familiarizing himself with the routine. There were 2 cows that needed milking, a few chickens, a mule, and some pigs. Nothing too complicated, but enough to require daily care. When Josie emerged an hour later, She had changed into a fresh dress and had packed a small bag. She had also gathered some items she thought Jacob might need, clean clothes and some of his favorite foods that might tempt his appetite once he was feeling better. "There's bread in the box and some preserves in the cellar," she told Harrison, her words tumbling out quickly. "The chickens need to be fed twice a day and the eggs collected. The cows need milking morning and evening. The mule can be stubborn, but if you're firm with him, he'll behave. Oh, and there's a leak in the barn roof on the east side, so if it rains, you'll need to move the hay." "Josie," Harrison said gently, stilling her nervous hands with his own, "I can handle it. Go take care of your brother." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face, and Harrison saw something shift in her expression, a recognition of the connection building between them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Harrison saddled the mule for her, loaded her bags, and helped her mount. He would have preferred to ride with her to Benton, but someone needed to stay with the animals, and it was only 5 miles. She would be there well before dark. "Be careful," he said, and she nodded. "I will. I'll come back in a few days to check on things and let you know how Jacob is doing." Harrison stood in the yard and watched her ride away, the same strange ache in his chest that he had felt the night before. The cabin felt emptier than it should have, considering he had only known Josie for a day. He turned away and threw himself into the work of caring for the animals, trying not to think about how comfortable it felt to be in this place, doing these simple tasks, or how much he was already looking forward to Josie's return. The next few days fell into a routine. Harrison rose at dawn, milked the cows, fed the chickens, collected eggs, and tended to the other animals. He repaired the leak in the barn roof, mended a broken fence post, and split enough wood to last through the next few weeks. The work was satisfying in a way that drifting from town to town had never been, and he found himself relaxing into it despite his better judgment. In the evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains, thinking about the turns his life had taken. For 10 years, he had been running from his grief, from the pain of losing his wife and daughter, from the guilt that maybe if he hadn't gone to war, he could have saved them. He had convinced himself that being alone was safer, that if he never cared about anyone again, he could never be hurt again. But Josie had shown him the flaw in that logic. Being alone wasn't safer, it was just lonelier. And maybe, just maybe, the risk of caring was worth the potential pain. On the 3rd day, Harrison saw a rider approaching and recognized Josie immediately. His heart gave a peculiar jump that he tried to ignore as he set down the axe he had been using to split wood and walked to meet her. "How is he?" Harrison asked as Josie dismounted. "Much better," she said, her face lighting up with relief. "The fever broke yesterday, and he's been eating solid food. Dr. Hendricks says he's healing remarkably well." "That's good news," Harrison said, genuinely pleased. They walked together toward the cabin, and Josie looked around at the evidence of Harrison's work, the repaired roof, the mended fence, the neatly stacked wood. "You've been busy," she observed. "The place needed some attention," Harrison said with a shrug. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." Josie turned to him, her expression serious. "You've done so much more than I asked. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Harrison said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'm just helping out." "It's more than that," Josie said softly. "You're a good man, Harrison Fletcher." Harrison looked away, unable to meet her eyes. He didn't feel like a good man. Good men didn't spend 10 years running from their past, didn't build walls so high that nobody could reach them. "Come inside," Josie said, breaking the tension. "I brought some supplies from town, including some real coffee. I thought we could have a cup and talk." They settled at the table and Josie made coffee while Harrison watched. It felt domestic and comfortable, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. "Jacob wants to meet you," Josie said as she poured the coffee. "He's grateful for what you've done, finding him and taking care of me." "I didn't do anything special," Harrison protested. "You did," Josie insisted. "You could have ridden on that first day, but you stayed. You could have just told me where Jacob was and left me to deal with it, but you offered to watch the homestead. You've been kinder to us than most people are to their own family." Harrison wrapped his hands around the warm cup, staring down into the dark liquid. "Maybe I was tired of riding on." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. When Harrison looked up, he found Josie watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Would you stay?" she asked quietly. "After Jacob comes home, I mean. There's plenty of work here and we could use the help. We could pay you not much, but room and board at least and a share of any profits." Harrison's first instinct was to say no, to stick with the plan of moving on before he got too attached. But looking at Josie, seeing the hope in her eyes, he found the word wouldn't come. "I'll think about it," he said finally, and saw disappointment flicker across her face before she hid it with a smile. "Of course," she said. "You don't owe us anything." But that was the problem, Harrison thought. He was starting to feel like he did owe them something. Like he owed it to Josie and to himself to at least try to let someone in. To see if those walls around his heart could come down without everything falling apart. Josie stayed for a few hours, checking on the animals and the cabin, making sure everything was in order. She seemed reluctant to leave, and Harrison was reluctant to let her go. They talked about small things, the weather, the animals, the town of Benton, but beneath the casual conversation was an undercurrent of something deeper, an awareness of each other that hadn't been there before. As the sun began to set, Josie finally mounted the mule for the ride back to town. "I'll come back in a few days," she said. "Jacob should be able to travel by the end of next week if all goes well." "I'll keep things running here," Harrison promised. He watched her ride away again, and this time the ache in his chest was stronger, harder to ignore. He was falling for her, he realized with a jolt. Despite all his resolutions, despite the walls he had built, despite the fear of getting hurt again, he was falling for Josie Parker. The realization should have sent him running. Instead, it made him smile. The days that followed were the longest of Harrison's life. He threw himself into work, not to avoid thinking about Josie, but because the work needed doing and because it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He found himself imagining what it would be like to stay here permanently, to wake up every morning with this view of the mountains, to share meals at that rough table, to have a home again. It was a dangerous line of thinking, and he knew it. But for the first time in 10 years, he let himself hope. When Josie returned a week later, she had Jacob with her. He was thin and pale but sitting upright in the wagon seat, and Harrison could see the family resemblance in his features. Jacob studied Harrison with open curiosity as they approached, and Harrison found himself hoping for the younger man's approval. "So you're the mysterious Harrison Fletcher," Jacob said as Josie helped him down from the wagon. His voice was weak but warm. "Josie hasn't stopped talking about you." "Jacob," Josie said, her cheeks flushing pink, and Harrison found the sight charming. "Just saying," Jacob said with a grin that made him look younger than his 26 years. "It's good to meet you, Harrison. Thank you for everything you've done for my sister and for me." "It was nothing," Harrison said, shaking Jacob's offered hand carefully, mindful of the younger man's injuries. "It wasn't nothing," Jacob said seriously. "You went out of your way to help strangers. That says a lot about a man's character." They got Jacob settled in his room, and over dinner that evening, the three of them talked easily. Jacob wanted to hear about everything Harrison had done to maintain the homestead, and Harrison found himself enjoying the younger man's company. Jacob was earnest and hardworking, with a quick wit and an obvious devotion to his sister. "The doctor says I need to take it easy for another few weeks," Jacob said, frustration evident in his tone. "I hate being laid up when there's so much work to be done." "You'll heal faster if you don't rush it," Josie said firmly. "And Harrison has been managing everything just fine." Jacob looked at Harrison thoughtfully. "Josie mentioned she asked if you'd stay on. Have you given it any thought?" Harrison glanced at Josie, who was suddenly very interested in her plate. "Some thought," he admitted. "We could really use the help," Jacob said. "This place is too much for one person to manage, and with me laid up, Josie's been trying to do everything herself. If you stayed, at least for a while, it would take a lot of pressure off both of us." "Jacob," Josie said warningly, but her brother just grinned. "I'm just being practical," he said innocently. Harrison found himself smiling. "I'll stay," he heard himself say, "at least for a while. See how it goes." The smile that lit up Josie's face made the decision worthwhile. Jacob looked pleased too, settling back in his chair with obvious relief. "That's settled then," Jacob said. "Welcome to the Parker homestead, Harrison Fletcher." The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jacob slowly regained his strength, though he was careful not to overdo it. Harrison took on most of the heavy work, with Josie helping where she could. They worked well together, Harrison discovered, anticipating each other's needs, developing a wordless communication that spoke of growing familiarity. And as they worked, they talked. Josie told him more about her life in Boston, about the society events and the careful manners, about how suffocating it had all felt after her father's financial ruin. She spoke of the relief of coming west, of the freedom of not having to worry about what people thought, even as she acknowledged the hardships of frontier life. Harrison found himself opening up in return, telling her things he had never told anyone. About his wife, Sarah, who had been sweet and gentle, about their daughter, Emma, who had had Sarah's blonde hair and his gray eyes, about coming home from the war to find them both in the town cemetery, about the guilt and grief that had nearly destroyed him. "You couldn't have saved them," Josie said gently one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Jacob had already gone to bed, and the night was peaceful around them. "You know that, don't you?" "I know it in my head," Harrison said, "but my heart has a harder time believing it." "I understand that," Josie said. "After my fiancé ended our engagement, I kept thinking about what I could have done differently, how I could have prevented it. But the truth is, there was nothing I could have done. He showed his true character, and painful as it was, I was better off knowing it." "Do you miss Boston?" Harrison asked. Josie was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I miss certain things. The theater, the libraries, the sense of being connected to a larger world. But I don't miss the falseness, the way everything was about appearances and status. Out here, people are more honest. Life is harder, but it's more real." "That's a good way of putting it," Harrison said. They sat in comfortable silence, and Harrison found himself acutely aware of Josie's presence beside him. The way the moonlight caught in her hair, the warmth of her shoulder inches from his own. He had been at the homestead for nearly a month now, and with each passing day, the thought of leaving became harder to bear. "Harrison," Josie said softly, and he turned to find her watching him. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," Harrison said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Harrison found himself leaning closer, drawn by the softness in Josie's eyes, by the slight part of her lips. And then Jacob called out from inside, asking for some water, and the spell was broken. Josie stood quickly, smoothing her skirts. "I should check on him," she said, not meeting Harrison's eyes. Harrison nodded, watching her disappear inside, and let out a long breath. He had almost kissed her, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. The walls around his heart had well and truly crumbled, and there was no putting them back together now. Over the following days, things shifted between them in small, subtle ways. Their hands would brush as they worked, and neither would pull away immediately. Their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and they would smile at some shared joke Jacob didn't understand. In the evenings, they found excuses to sit together on the porch, talking long after Jacob had retired. Jacob, for his part, seemed to encourage the growing closeness. He would conveniently remember something he needed to do inside whenever Harrison and Josie were talking, or would suggest that Harrison accompany Josie on errands to Benton. Harrison suspected the younger man was matchmaking, and he found he didn't mind. It was 6 weeks after Harrison's arrival when everything changed. Jacob had recovered enough to handle most of the daily chores, though he still tired easily. Harrison had been thinking about his future, about whether he should stay permanently or move on as he had always planned. The question weighed on him, especially as his feelings for Josie grew stronger with each passing day. He was in the barn, mucking out stalls when Josie appeared in the doorway. The afternoon sunlight backlit her, turning her auburn hair to fire, and Harrison's breath caught at the sight. "Harrison," she said, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" "Of course," Harrison said, setting aside his pitchfork and brushing the dust from his hands. They walked out to the small creek that ran behind the property, a place that had become their favorite spot for private conversations. The water bubbled over smooth stones, and cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. They sat on a fallen log, not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. "Jacob is planning to go back to Benton next week," Josie said, watching the play of light on the water. "To finish the business he started before the fight. He asked me to go with him." "That makes sense," Harrison said, though his stomach tightened at the thought of her leaving. "I told him I didn't want to go," Josie continued, "that I'd rather stay here, and he asked me why." She turned to face Harrison, her green eyes serious. "I couldn't tell him the real reason." Harrison's heart began to pound. "What's the real reason?" "You," Josie said simply. "I don't want to go because that would mean time away from you, and I find I don't want to be away from you anymore." Harrison stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Josie," he began, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I know you've been hurt, that you lost people you loved. I know you built walls to protect yourself, and I understand that. But Harrison, I've fallen in love with you. I can't help it, and I can't hide it anymore. If you don't feel the same way, if you still plan to move on, then tell me now. But if there's any chance that you might feel something for me too, then I needed you to know how I feel." The vulnerability in her voice, the courage it took to speak those words, broke through the last of Harrison's resistance. He reached out and took her hands in his, holding them gently. "I've been trying not to fall in love with you," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been telling myself it was too soon, that I wasn't ready, that I couldn't risk the pain of losing someone again. But the truth is, I fell in love with you that first day, when I saw you sorting beans on the porch. I've just been too scared to admit it." Tears spilled down Josie's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You're not scared anymore." "I'm terrified," Harrison admitted, "but I'm more scared of losing you by not taking the chance. Josie Parker, I love you. I want to stay here, not just as a hired hand, but as your husband if you'll have me. I want to build a life with you, to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to stop running and finally come home." Josie let out a sound between a laugh and a sob and threw her arms around his neck. Harrison wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling the rightness of it in every cell of his body. When she pulled back enough to look at him, her face was radiant with joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. I want all of that too, everything you said." Harrison cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a gentle kiss that spoke of new beginnings and healing hearts. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling and the world seemed brighter somehow, full of possibility. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and when they told Jacob, he let out a whoop of delight that probably carried all the way to Benton. "About time," he said, grinning at them both. "I was beginning to think I was going to have to lock you two in the barn together." "You knew?" Josie asked, blushing. "Everyone knew except apparently you two," Jacob said. "The way you looked at each other, the way you found excuses to be near each other, it was pretty obvious." Harrison felt his own face heat, but he was too happy to be embarrassed. "We'll need to go into Benton soon," he said. "Find a preacher." "There's a circuit preacher who comes through once a month," Jacob said. "He's due next week. We could have the wedding then if you don't want to wait." Harrison looked at Josie and she nodded. "Next week sounds perfect," she said. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Josie enlisted the help of Mrs. Morrison from the hotel and some other women in Benton to help her make a proper wedding dress. Harrison and Jacob worked on sprucing up the cabin and the property, wanting everything to look its best. Word spread through the small community, and neighbors Harrison had never met stopped by to offer congratulations and help. It was strange and wonderful to be part of a community again, to have people care about his happiness. For so long, Harrison had been a drifter, a loner who passed through towns without leaving a mark. But here in Benton, Colorado, he was putting down roots, becoming part of something larger than himself. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. The ceremony was held at the cabin, with the circuit preacher officiating and what seemed like half the town in attendance. Harrison stood at the makeshift altar Jacob had built, dressed in the new suit they had purchased in Benton, his hands sweating despite the cool September air. And then Josie appeared, and everything else faded away. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, altered from one of her fancier Boston gowns, with wildflowers woven into her hair. She was the most beautiful thing Harrison had ever seen, and when she smiled at him, his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Harrison spoke his vows in a clear voice, promising to love and cherish Josie for the rest of his days, to be faithful and true, to build a life with her. Josie's voice trembled slightly as she made her own promises, but her eyes never left his, and Harrison could see the love shining in them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Josie to the cheers and applause of their friends and neighbors. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, that marked the beginning of their new life together, that spoke of hope and healing and love strong enough to overcome past pain. The celebration afterward was boisterous and joyful. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food that neighbors had contributed. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts. Harrison found himself surrounded by well-wishers, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, and he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since before the war. But his attention kept returning to Josie, watching her laugh with Mrs. Morrison, dance with Jacob, accept hugs and good wishes from women she had befriended in town. She caught him looking and smiled, excusing herself from her conversation to come to his side. "Having a good time, Mr. Fletcher?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "The best time, Mrs. Fletcher," Harrison replied, loving the sound of her new name. They danced together as the sun set, swaying to the fiddle music under the stars. Harrison held Josie close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his, and thanked whatever providence had led him to this place, to this woman, to this moment. Eventually, the guests began to depart, calling out final congratulations and blessings. Jacob had arranged to spend the night at a neighbor's farm, giving the newlyweds privacy. As the last wagon pulled away, Harrison and Josie stood together in the yard, watching the dust settle in the moonlight. "Alone at last," Josie said softly. Harrison turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. "I love you, Josie Fletcher, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Josie whispered, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." They went inside together, closing the door on the old life and opening a new chapter filled with love and promise. The months that followed were the happiest of Harrison's life. He and Josie settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked the homestead together, expanding their small herd of cattle and improving their crops. Jacob remained with them, an integral part of their family, and the three of them formed a strong partnership. Winter came, and with it the harsh Colorado cold. But the cabin was snug and warm, and Harrison found a deep contentment in the simple domesticity of it all. Evenings were spent by the fire, Josie reading aloud while Harrison whittled and Jacob mended tack. They talked and laughed and planned for the future, and Harrison felt the last of his old wounds finally healing. In February, Josie told him she was expecting a child, and Harrison felt a joy so profound it almost frightened him. He had lost a daughter once, and the thought of having another child brought back painful memories. But Josie helped him work through his fears, holding him when the nightmares came, reminding him that this was a new beginning, not a repeat of the past. "We're going to be fine," she would say, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "All of us." Jacob was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming an uncle and immediately began making plans for additions to the cabin. They would need another room for the baby, and while they were at it, he suggested, maybe they should build him a small place of his own on the property, give the new family some space. Harrison and Josie protested, insisting that Jacob was family and would always have a place with them. But Jacob was adamant, and Harrison suspected that the younger man was also thinking about his own future, about maybe finding a wife of his own someday. Spring brought new life to the land and new growth to Josie's belly. She bloomed with pregnancy, becoming even more beautiful in Harrison's eyes. He was fiercely protective of her, insisting she not overwork herself, though Josie insisted she was perfectly capable of doing her normal chores. They compromised, with Josie handling the lighter tasks while Harrison and Jacob took on the heavy work. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing gifts for the expected baby and offering advice. The community that had welcomed Harrison and Josie's marriage now rallied around the growing family, and Harrison felt blessed beyond measure. In late August, as the summer heat began to give way to cooler days, Josie went into labor. Mrs. Morrison came to help, along with two other experienced women from town. Harrison paced outside the bedroom door, terrified and excited in equal measure. Jacob sat with him, offering quiet support, and Harrison was grateful for his brother-in-law's presence. The labor was long but not overly difficult, and as dawn broke over the mountains, Harrison heard the strong, healthy cry of his newborn child. Mrs. Morrison opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son," she said, "a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing fine." Harrison rushed into the room, and the sight that greeted him brought tears to his eyes. Josie lay in the bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a red-faced, squalling infant wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as Harrison approached, her smile tired but genuine. "Come meet your son," she said softly, Harrison sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face. The baby had stopped crying and was staring up at him with unfocused eyes. He had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features, and Harrison fell in love instantly. "He's beautiful," Harrison whispered, touching one small hand with his finger. The baby's fingers wrapped around his, and Harrison felt his heart expand in his chest. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Samuel," Josie said. "After the doctor who saved Jacob's life. If it hadn't been for Dr. Hendricks, Jacob would have died, and we never would have had all this." "Samuel Fletcher," Harrison said, testing the name. "I like it. Sam for short." They spent the next hour marveling at their son, counting his fingers and toes, watching him sleep, and discussing all their hopes and dreams for him. Jacob came in to meet his nephew, handling the tiny baby with surprising gentleness and declaring him the finest boy in all of Colorado. As the women cleaned up and prepared to leave, Mrs. Morrison pulled Harrison aside. "You've got a good family here," she said. "Take care of them." "I will," Harrison promised, "with everything I have." And he did. As Sam grew from infant to baby to toddler, Harrison threw himself into being the best father and husband he could be. He taught Sam to walk, holding his chubby hands as he took his first wobbling steps. He read to him in the evenings, even though Sam was too young to understand the words. He showed him the animals, the mountains, the stars, wanting his son to love this land as much as he did. Josie watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love. The man who had arrived at their homestead with walls around his heart had transformed into a devoted father and partner, fully present in every moment. The shadows that had haunted his eyes had faded, replaced by contentment and joy. Jacob, true to his word, built himself a small cabin on the far side of the property. It was modest but comfortable, and it gave him independence while still keeping him close to his sister and her family. He had started courting a young woman from Benton, the daughter of the man who owned the general store, and Harrison and Josie were hopeful that he would soon have his own family. Time passed in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Seasons turned, bringing their cycle of planting and harvest, snow and sunshine. Sam grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, Josie became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Emma after Harrison's first child. Harrison had worried that naming their daughter after the child he had lost would bring back the pain, but instead, it felt like a healing, a way of honoring the past while embracing the future. Little Emma was nothing like his first daughter had been. She had Josie's auburn hair and a fierce independence that showed itself from birth. But she was loved no less for being different, and Harrison found that his heart was large enough to hold love for both the daughter he had lost and the children he now had. Jacob married his sweetheart, a sweet-natured girl named Mary, and they settled into his cabin. Within a year, they had their first child, a boy they named after Jacob and Harrison both, Jacob Harrison Parker. The cousins grew up together, running wild on the property, learning to ride and rope and handle the animals. The homestead prospered under the combined efforts of the two families. They expanded their cattle operation, built a larger barn, and added more rooms to both cabins. Harrison, who had spent 10 years as a drifter with no place to call home, now had deep roots in this Colorado soil. He knew every rock and tree on their land, had helped build every structure, had poured his sweat and dreams into making it successful. On quiet evenings, he and Josie would sit on the porch as they had in the early days of their relationship, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, but always they were together, and that was enough. You ever regret it? Josie asked one evening when Sam was 7 and Emma was 4. Staying here, giving up the wandering life. Harrison turned to her, seeing the gray threads that were beginning to appear in her auburn hair, the lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of years of laughter and love. She was even more beautiful to him now than she had been that first day. Not for a single moment, he said honestly. You gave me back my life, Josie. Before I met you, I was just existing, moving from place to place without purpose or joy. You reminded me that it was possible to love again, to hope again, to build something lasting. You and the children, Jacob and Mary and little Jake, this land, this life, it's everything I never knew I needed. Josie reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You saved me too, she said. I was so lonely before you came along. Jacob was wonderful, but it's not the same as having a partner, someone to share everything with. You made me believe in love again after I thought that part of my life was over. They sat together as the stars came out, listening to the sounds of their children playing inside, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the gentle night sounds of their thriving homestead. Harrison thought back to that day 10 years ago when he had ridden up to find a woman sorting beans on a porch, never imagining that his life was about to change forever. He had been a man with a closed heart, convinced that love only led to pain, that the safest course was to remain alone. But Josie had shown him that a closed heart was really just a prison, and that the risk of love was worth any potential pain. She had helped him sort through the walls he had built, discarding the bad and keeping the good, until his heart was open again and ready to receive the greatest gift of all. Years continued to pass, and the Fletcher family grew and thrived. Sam grew into a tall, capable young man who worked the ranch alongside his father. Emma became a spirited young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. They had 2 more children over the years, another boy and another girl, and the cabin rang with the sounds of a large, happy family. Jacob and Mary also had more children, and the cousins grew up as close as siblings. The 2 families worked the expanded property together, building something that would last for generations. They became pillars of the Benton community, known for their hard work and generosity, always ready to help a neighbor in need. Harrison's hair turned gray and his face grew lined, but his eyes remained clear, and his love for Josie never wavered. She aged beside him, her beauty maturing into something deeper and more lasting than youthful prettiness. They celebrated 20 years of marriage, then 30, and with each passing year their bond only strengthened. When Sam was 22, he married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a capable young woman named Sarah, and brought her to live on the homestead. Harrison helped them build their own cabin, watching with pride as his son began his own family. Within a year, Sam and Sarah presented him and Josie with their first grandchild, a boy with gray eyes and a strong cry. Holding his grandson for the first time, Harrison felt the circle complete. He had lost so much in his younger years, had thought that the pain of that loss would define him forever. But standing there with 3 generations of Fletchers around him, he knew that love had won in the end. Love had healed him, grown him, made him into the man he was meant to be. Emma also married well, to a young man from Benton who had taken up doctoring after apprenticing with Dr. Hendricks. They stayed in town but visited often, and Emma's children spent summers on the ranch, learning the skills their grandfather and uncle could teach them. As Harrison approached his 70th year, he looked back on his life with satisfaction and peace. The nightmares of the war and the early losses had faded, replaced by dreams of the good years, the love shared, the family built. He had done more than survive. He had thrived, And it was all because a lonely woman sorting beans had seen past his walls to the man beneath. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air held the first hints of coming winter, Harrison and Josie sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Their children were grown, their grandchildren thriving, and the ranch they had built together would continue for generations to come. "We did good, didn't we?" Josie said, leaning against Harrison's shoulder. "We did great," Harrison corrected, wrapping his arm around her. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you remember that first day?" Josie asked. "When you rode up and asked for water?" "I remember everything," Harrison said. "The way the sun caught in your hair, the wariness in your eyes, the kindness you showed a stranger. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." "I thought you were dangerous," Josie admitted with a laugh. "So stern and closed off, I almost didn't invite you to stay for dinner." "I'm glad you did," Harrison said softly. "That dinner changed my life." "Mine too," Josie agreed. "I was sorting beans and trying not to think about how lonely I was, how much I had given up to come west. And then you appeared, and suddenly everything changed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Inside, they could hear their youngest daughter, now 17, singing as she prepared dinner. Sam's oldest boy was in the barn, tending to the animals. The sounds of family, of home, surrounded them. "I love you, Josie Fletcher," Harrison said. "More now than ever." "I love you too, Harrison Fletcher," Josie replied. "Forever and always." The stars came out one by one, and a cool breeze whispered through the cottonwoods. Harrison held his wife close and thought about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers to lovers to partners to grandparents. It had been a long road, sometimes difficult, but worth every step. He had found her sorting beans for dinner, a simple domestic task that had led to the greatest love of his life. She had helped him sort through his closed heart, removing the barriers that had kept him isolated and alone. Together, they had built not just a home but a legacy, not just a family but a future. And as they sat there under the Colorado stars, surrounded by the land they loved and the family they had created, Harrison Fletcher knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The cowboy had finally found his home, and in doing so, had found himself. The years that followed were golden. Harrison and Josie grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their children have children, and their grandchildren begin to have children of their own. The homestead that had started as a small cabin and a few head of cattle had grown into a thriving ranch that supported multiple families. Harrison never regretted the decision he had made that day to stay, to open his heart, to take a chance on love again. Josie had been his salvation, his second chance, his greatest gift. And every day until his last, he thanked whatever power had guided him to that lonely cabin where a woman sat sorting beans, waiting without knowing it for the closed-hearted cowboy who would become her forever love. Their story became legend in Benton, told to new generations as an example of how love could heal even the deepest wounds, how it was never too late to start over, how the simplest moments could change everything. And whenever anyone asked the secret to their long and happy marriage, both Harrison and Josie would smile and say the same thing. "We took the time to sort through what mattered," Harrison would say. "And we kept what was good," Josie would add. Together, they had sorted through pain and loss, fear and doubt, and had found love waiting at the bottom of it all. And that love had been enough to build a life, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. When Harrison Fletcher finally passed away at the age of 78, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, he died with Josie's hand in his and a smile on his face. He had lived a full life, rich with love and purpose, and he faced the end with the same courage he had shown throughout his years. Josie followed him 6 months later, as if she couldn't bear to be parted from him for long. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the same Colorado sky that had witnessed their love story. Their gravestone bore a simple inscription that told their story better than any lengthy epitaph could. Harrison and Josie Fletcher. They sorted through the pain and found love. And the ranch they had built together continued to thrive, home to Fletchers and Parkers for generations to come, a lasting testament to the power of love to transform lives and heal hearts. The cowboy had found his peace, and the woman who had been sorting beans had found her forever partner. And together, they had created something beautiful that would never be forgotten. Their great-grandchildren still told the story on quiet evenings of how their great-grandfather had ridden up to the cabin one dusty afternoon, how their great-grandmother had shown him kindness, how a simple meal had led to a lifetime of love. It was a story of second chances and healing hearts, of the courage to love again after loss, of building something lasting from the rubble of broken dreams. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with Harrison and Josie sitting on their porch under the stars, hands entwined, surrounded by the family and home they had created together. It was a happy ending earned through courage and faith, through choosing love over fear, through taking the risk of opening closed hearts. The cowboy had sorted through his pain and found his purpose. The woman had sorted through her loneliness and found her partner. Together, they had sorted through life itself and discovered that love, real and true and lasting, was worth any price, any risk, any leap of faith. And so their story lived on, a beacon of hope for anyone who thought it was too late for love, who thought their heart was too damaged to risk again, who thought the walls they had built were too high to ever come down. Harrison and Josie Fletcher proved that it was never too late, that hearts could heal, and that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the simplest moments. A stranger asking for water and a woman sorting beans for dinner.